Welcome to Friday night's video in our second master series. This is the 8th video in our second master series, and we're going to talk about a huge problem for analysis. I've found this to be a huge problem with just about everybody I've talked to when they're trying to analyze audio, and causes them to throw away some of the most important tools they have is their eyeballs and the analysis tools they have, and learning how to use them well because they're not getting information they can understand or visualize to where it makes absolutely no sense for them to utilize it, and they start just trying to rely on their ears and throwing away half their tools that are very important. So before we get into some analysis it's really going to take you to the next level like I've been talking about as an audio engineer, let's talk about that problem. Here is the problem. The first problem is that you run into this problem that sound sculpting and think, okay, an example is sound sculpting and equalization. So that can be with any type of effect, whether you're just trying to build the whole sound or you're trying to actual sound sculpt. And during equalization is static. Equalization, you're trying to equalize the whole spectrum. You're not trying, it's a static EQ. You're not focused on any particular area. That's why I really tried to point out in the equalization phase during my last master series about how important it is to go through there and really look at the equalized contour. Whereas sound sculpting, you are trying to focus on individual content inside of whatever you're working on, which in looking at it from equalization, let's say I'm trying to fix, this is the root, this is the first octave, and this is the fifth above the first octave in this vocal. Well, I'm going to want to attenuate or boost that to try to sculpt this sound to make it sound good the way I want it to, which means I'm going to have to use automation to follow that part of whatever sound I'm trying to sound sculpt before I even equalize, so that it falls around while the guy's going da 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 da, that harmonic is going to move around, and anything else that you're trying to work on is going to move around. And so it's a huge issue to get into your head, no matter what type of processing or what you're doing or any type of sound sculpting you're trying to do. Static type of work, or with like equalization, or work that you have to move around with and use automation to follow the envelope of sound. That's a huge thing you have to get into your head. They're two different things. The second thing is, this is another huge problem that I've found that most people just have a huge problem getting around. I've recorded this vocal file of myself going da 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 da, and it's going to show this moving around. So basically, you know, when I had talked about in my last master series of getting a test vocal, test capture, that means a bass note, a guitar chord, a piano note or piano chord, or a vocalist holding a note, holding a chord, maybe several that are in the lower frequency spectrum and the upper frequency spectrum, because the transducer and the sound output can change depending on if it's a lower or higher end note, to get that capture to be able to analyze. And if they've got something that somebody else has recorded, to be able to find a note somewhere in there and loop it so they can analyze a sound. And I'll show you why. Because when people start trying to analyze it, here I've got this vocal here. And this could be like any production, anybody sent you some music or something you recorded, and it's going all over the place. It's like some kind of wave, and no matter how I look at it, whether I look at it FFT or 12th octave, or if I look at it with, you know, an FFT curve or whatever, it looks like some kind of wave rolling around in a bucket of water that really is very hard to define sometimes. And same with the scope. You got the scope doing this. How am I supposed to define that? Why do I even use my scope? There's no point in even pulling out my scope when I'm looking at that. What am I supposed to do with that? What is that telling me? That's not telling me nothing. I've had my DAW for 12 years and I've never even pulled out my scope. Ever. Because I don't have any use for it. It's like, because you don't know how to use it. You know, does that make sense? Whereas you've got that looking at that, and it's really hard to define what's going on. So when we go through this analysis series, I really hope that you can understand why you want a static note to focus on the things we're talking about, to be able to analyze it well and to be able to apply processing or whatever you're doing to it well. Because if you switch that and you go to this note that I saved that's up here, all of a sudden that's what you got. And you can really focus in on what's going on there. You can actually freeze it to see what's happening with it. You can expand it and blow it up to see it a little bit better. You can go to a smaller area to really get an idea of what that is. Does that make sense? This looks a little erratic right here, but most of the time that you can get it zoomed in on it pretty good to where you can eventually see what's happening with it and be able to see what if it's a periodic waveform, aperiodic, semi-periodic, whatever's going on, to really be able to see what the hell you got to work with and what's happening. And it can be the same thing in the spectrum. Then I'm looking at the spectrum, and when I go to look at with these different analysis tools, that I'm really being able to see what's happening there. So I can really map out what's going on as far as the sound envelope. And this is huge because then you can really sit down and analyze it well and understand what's happening. Does that make sense? Whether you've got that test capture or whether you found some note in whatever is going on, like in this, that you can loop and really see what's happening to define components of that sound. This is a huge thing because otherwise I've seen so many people, whether it's they're looking at the scope, the spectrometer, the phase meter, looking at it with their EQ. EQs are great for analyzing audio sometimes. They're level meters, view meters, whatever they're looking at when they get into really serious analysis, then it makes it almost impossible for them to utilize it well. And on top of it, that let's say you've got that and you're trying to do something to it. So, whether or not you're trying to say you've got that track and you're trying to compress things. So you're trying to compress things with it moving around all over the place. If you're trying to compress it or add EQ or reverberation, saturation, delay, chorus, whatever, you're not really getting to see what all is happening there well, unless you can isolate the sound like on this track here, so you can really see what's happening and what you're doing. Does that make sense? And a prime example of that is if you're doing some more elaborate sound sculpting, like let's say you've split the audio to where you've got that going on and you've used some kind of channel split tool like Sigmod, or in my DAW I can actually split it, and I've got two different channels. I'm going to frequency split it or channel split it to work on the right and left, or frequency split it when I'm doing like compression. I'm doing compression on a certain frequency range or a different channel or something like that, and I want to be able to visualize that. What's going on? What's it doing to that sound? Because I know it's going to affect it in the same way all over the place. And so it becomes this huge problem so that you can visualize what the heck you're doing and what you're doing something to well, which sounds funny, but it's so true. So this problem that I've ran into when I see people trying to understand that, immediately they throw their eyeballs in the garbage because they have no idea what they're looking at. In the next videos, as we go through this, I start trying to explain to you stuff, and I'm trying to show you stuff and how to work on what this looks like, right? When I've got this note going across here, but you pull out your stuff and your stuff looks like this other wave file, and you're seeing this. And you're going, well, my stuff doesn't look like that. How am I supposed to isolate any of that stuff? How am I supposed to, and they'll get frustrated and they'll throw their analysis tools in the garbage and say, I have no idea why I even use them. Some idiot created those things because I just use my ears because that's stupidity. What is that? How am I going to do anything with that? I can't make no sense of that. It looks like a bunch of garbage rolling around. It looks like colored water in a bucket that's rolling around all over the place. It doesn't make no sense to me, no way. And I don't understand how you're isolating any of that other stuff you talked about, because the shit you talk about looks like this stuff up here. When I isolate that sound, the stuff you're talking about looks like this. If I isolate that sound, that I can look at. I can isolate a whole lot of stuff with this. Now I can isolate that, but that's not what my music looks like, bro. Does that make sense? So they get frustrated, so that they can't go in there, make their analysis on some note, or have a test capture of that sound that they're trying to work on, so they can apply it across the performance, or going to some note and really analyzing it so they can go in there and go, okay, Bob's right here. Where's a good place to do this with Bob? Maybe right here. Maybe Bob's got a good note right here, and he's holding some type of note that I can look at for a little bit. Let's see. Maybe I can. and it's like, well, that's better than what the other thing was, and I'm trying to define that into where I can start to get that to where I can get a little bit better information about what's happening. And if that's not going to do it, maybe over here. Maybe he's got a note over here on the bass guitar, the piano, or the vocalist that I can isolate that away and go, how's that look? Then I refine that a little bit, come in a little bit, trying to be able to isolate that content so I can see basically the harmonic content, harmonic distortion, saturations, all kinds of things. You see things like this going on right here that looks fatter because obviously at this point he's going to or something. But it's giving you a better idea of what's going on so you can actually use your analysis tools. And in most good performance, you should be able to find some place, somewhere, to where you can loop a sound somewhere if that's all you got to work with because it's somebody else's stuff, that you can get a pretty good analysis here. I see a little bit of modulation, frequency modulation, and volume modulation here, but for the most part I can see this mapped out fairly well to where I could work on it, and go, well, what do I need to do with Bob's voice to make him sound like Frank Sinatra or Beyonce or whatever he's trying to sound like, because his voice doesn't really sound like that and it's not really meshing well with what he wants to do and he's got some issues, or that's the way he sounds and he wants me to clean. I mean, bass players, guitar players, keyboards, all kinds of stuff that you just, if you got this kind of thing to work with here and you can map it out, the test capture is hugely important because then you can get stuff like this to look at that will look like the stuff I'm trying to explain to you when we go through analysis tools. And why I had you set up the session the way I did, because you really need you need to look for that stuff. And looking at at some of the waves like this can really help you when you're looking at more of a mess and you're going, well, it's a mess. I got to isolate part of this sound, the bass player, a note, or a chord or something, so I can figure out what to do. That way that I can sound sculpt it well and or equalize it well. As an example, when we're doing equalization, there's two different things of sound sculpting using equalization and static equalization. That way I got a better chance of doing them well. That doesn't mean that you might still have little issues and your stuff might not come out perfect as NASA, as some mathematical formula, but you certainly got a much better chance of getting closer to the ballpark to where that your work is done in a better way that's targeted to actually get something done that you're trying to do rather than just a shot in the dark. Does that make sense? And you get this problem that you can hear well, but with your eyes and your ears, you got a much better chance of going, whoa, in this oboe, for some reason, that I've got this harmonic that's way up or something. I need to use automation, attenuate that, or whatever. Does that make sense? And you'll see when I pull out some sound waves that it's a good idea to get some test vocals, violin one note, bass one note, and map out the harmonics and distortion and noise and things like that we'll talk about on some type of piece of paper or something you do with your computer. You'll see that when I first get into Spectrum Analyzer, that you take a look at that and you can do that yourself to map out different sounds, so you can see that, well, in this oboe there's a problem, because normally an oboe doesn't have that harmonic, is not way up here normally on an oboe, so I know it's a dang problem because I've analyzed it. That's a huge thing also to make you that engineer on the next level. Does that make sense? So the funny thing is that can apply to anything. If you're going into your tools and you start trying to work on this sound from this vocalist that he's doing this performance, but you got this test capture to test doing compression, splitting compression, compressing only on the mid range or the upper range or the lower end, or when you do EQ work, what happens, or when you add reverberation to see what effect it has on the sound and be able to visualize it well, saturations, anything that you're doing to be able to analyze it well. And especially if you're getting into things like doing, you're splitting the channel, you're splitting the channel to where you're going to be working on the left side or the right side, or you're going to, you're going to channel split it, or you're going to even split the frequency range to where you're working on different frequency ranges. You can split the frequency up in between the low and the mids and the highs, or however you want, to try to sound sculpt this sound throughout the performance, because or you can see here the whole upper end got attenuated the heck out of it, but I can visualize it and I know what harmonics it took out and what was going on besides just listening to it. So I know that sounds funny, but it's a huge thing to get in your head so that when we start getting into the analysis here, that you're really taking that into consideration and utilizing that to help you. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next video when we start checking out our analysis tools.